Leadership series. I'm Anna Gavell, Hello, everyone. Let me make sure everyone heard me. Welcome to Devex's U.S. Global Leadership Series. I'm Anna Gavell, Managing Editor of Devex, and I'm pleased to welcome our special guest today, Representative John Garamendi. Hello, Congressman, and thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So for those who don't know, Congressman Garamendi represents California's 8th Congressional District and is now in his 8th term in the House, where he serves on the Armed Services Committee as well as the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. The congressman entered politics in 1974, where he was elected to the California State Legislature, where he authored the first solar, wind, and energy conservation tax credit in the nation. He was appointed Deputy Secretary of the Interior in 1995 by President Clinton, spearheading projects to restore the environment in areas like the San Francisco Bay, while also increasing California's freshwater supply. With 30 years of experience in California water issues, Congressman Garamendi is a leading advocate for conserving natural resources, supporting renewable energy investments, and reversing the alarming trends of climate change. Before entering the world of politics, he and his wife Patty served in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia in the late 1960s. While in Ethiopia, they taught 7th and 8th grade students and worked alongside local leaders to improve the resources available to the community. So Congressman, let's start there. Can you talk a bit about your time in the Peace Corps, what it was like, and how it inspired your public service career?
Well, it really was the beginning. Patty and I were married in our senior year at UC Berkeley. I was being recruited to play professional football. I asked her to marry me. She said, I would love to, but I'm going to the Peace Corps. I don't think this is going to work. So I said, let's go to the Peace Corps. And we did. And it really set the course of our life. Certainly internationally, Patty went on to work internationally with the Clinton administration, both as a senior executive in the Peace Corps and then on to USDA, where she oversaw the distribution of American food for refugee and famine relief around the world. And so we've been working on this all of our lives, and even to this moment, with the famines in Africa and around the world, we both are very seriously engaged in dealing with that. And of course, the public service side of it. It was John F. Kennedy who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but rather what you can do for your country and the world at large. And so that's been our task. And along the way, we've raised a wonderful family, 6 children, 14 grandchildren now. It's been a real life of purpose and service and a good life. And we're still going.
That's great to hear. Now, earlier this year, you introduced the Peace Corps Reauthorization Act. So obviously you are quite the core member for life. It's a bipartisan bill that would channel more resources to the Peace Corps. Can you talk more about what those resources would entail and what the status of the bill is?
Sure. Well, the Peace Corps Reauthorization Act is really the first time in more than 22 years that Peace Corps would be reauthorized once we get this through into the president. It really updates a lot of the underlying responsibilities and opportunities for the Peace Corps volunteers themselves. There's a better guarantee of healthcare and workers' compensation. Being in the Peace Corps around the world can be a very dangerous, and many Peace Corps volunteers are injured or come home with some serious illness. So we updated that to make sure that they have the appropriate resources available to them, not only while in service. There's also additional responsibilities for the administration of the system. And hopefully, if we get this thing done, there'll be a better authority for the funding of the Peace Corps. So it's really an updating of the entire underlying law for the establishment and for the operation of the Peace Corps. Necessary. 22 years ago was a long time. A lot of things have changed over those years. But what we do find is that countries all around the world are clamoring to get in line to get the new Peace Corps volunteers that are returning to service after the entire organization shut down because of COVID. So it's starting back up now, and the enthusiasm for the host countries is really overwhelming. And frankly, it is very, very exciting. Peace Corps is coming back. We're in, I think, about a dozen countries right now. We'll be in many more in each week that goes by. And last night here at our home in Washington, D.C., some of our colleagues from way back when, about 20 of them, showed up on our doorstep, and we had a fabulous meal of Ethiopian food, sharing stories. Interestingly, all of those return volunteers from so many, many years ago are still very, very active in their communities. They're community leaders. They're involved in programs dealing with refugees from around the world, social programs. Many of them are still in the media and the like. It's very interesting that when you come home, your Peace Corps service isn't over. One of the goals of the Peace Corps is to bring it home and continue your service here in America.
Now, are you optimistic about the bill's passage, given that this isn't the first time the legislation has been introduced, and given that you now have to reckon with a GOP-controlled House intent on spending cuts, all with a looming potential government shutdown? What are the prospects of the bill?
Well, there are two different pieces to this. One is the bill itself, which is the updating of the authorities, the underlying laws and responsibilities of the Peace Corps organization itself, and the benefits to the volunteers. The second part is the appropriations part. The appropriations have been ongoing year after year during the intervening time when the authority had lapsed, and so it was the appropriations. Both of them are in good shape. There'll be some discussion about the amount of money. I think we'll probably, hopefully, wind up with the Senate version, which is just a little less than $500 million, which is, just not even pocket change for the federal government. But the bill itself, I think, will be good. We have good support. It's bipartisan. My co-author is Garrett Graves out of Louisiana. A very strong supporter of the Peace Corps, Republican, not a volunteer, but understands the reason why the Peace Corps is important around the world. Similarly, on the Senate side, we have very good support in the Foreign Relations Committee on the Senate side from both Democrats, the ranking Republican, and Menendez, the chairman of that committee. So we're in good shape. It's just a matter of getting the floor time, getting past all the chaos that's going on right now as we wrap up. Well, we'll see if we wrap up the appropriation and keep government operating. All of those things will be delaying it. Probably November, maybe December, we should be able to move the bill, things quiet down a little bit. We got it all the way through the House, all the way to the Senate floor last session. And unfortunately, a certain senator out of Kentucky decided that he just wanted to hold everything up. And among the things he held up was the ability of the Peace Corps reauthorization bill to go to its final vote on the floor of the Senate. And so hopefully he'll be in a better mood this year, and we'll get this thing done.
He shall not be named.
No, we don't need to name names.
We'll leave it at Kentucky. So I wanted to switch gears to climate change. You've been a leading advocate on water conservation and environmental issues for decades. What lessons have you learned, particularly around water conservation in California, that might be applied to developing countries on the front lines of climate change who are facing similar issues?
Well, actually, my experience at this goes back to my childhood. I grew up on a ranch in California. And the one thing that was absolutely critical was, can we keep the springs operating in the late summer? Is there going to be water for the cattle, for our own home on our ranch? It was always day to day, keep that water system going. Pipes break, spring goes dry, we're in trouble. So from my very earliest days, I knew the value of water. And in Ethiopia, it was the same. A good deal of my work, while Patty and I were both teachers, we also worked with a team of community development Ethiopians that came to our village and worked in our region on various community development projects, community planning, which I must say some 40 years later, when we returned to our village, the plans that we wrote 40 years previously were in effect. They'd actually built what we had designed back then, water systems, simple water systems and the like. Returning to California, after that Peace Corps experience and being a young legislator, I watched really in horror as the most productive agricultural land in the world was being paved over into subdivisions, and wrote legislation way back then in the 70s to set up a mechanism that would discourage urban development on prime agricultural land and the water that goes with it. And so even to this day, this is a continuing fight in California. In fact, we've got a major brawl going right now about some Silicon Valley tech billionaires that want to build a new city in an agricultural area. So the water systems are absolutely critical, not just in California, not just in the West. The entire Southeast also is experiencing a water crisis, and certainly around the world. There's a very, very good argument to be made that the disruption of the social and political processes in the Middle East is directly related to water, specifically Syria and Iraq. The two major rivers there are in jeopardy, and the agriculture that was once supported by those rivers is essentially disappearing, creating migration into cities, creating disruption of the economy. And certainly across the broad Sahel of Africa, we're seeing migration, climate migration, as the Sahel moves southward into areas of Central Africa that were once lush and green. So we're seeing climate change playing out around the world, and certainly in the West. Came across a very, very interesting little factoid yesterday. We were talking with the Nature Conservancy, the League of Conservation Voters, about some projects that we're working on in California. And they had circled an area in the Eastern Sierras. And they say, now we need to get this one done because it is the only place in which the Joshua trees are surviving or thriving. And I knew the area, and I said, well, that's on the slope of the mountains on the Eastern Sierras. And he said, that's right. In the high desert of California, in the Mojave Desert, the Joshua trees are dying because of the heat and the lack of water. But he said, we need to preserve this because the Joshua trees seem to be thriving in this higher elevation. And I said, I'm not surprised. In 1998, in the preparation for the Kyoto Climate Conference, 5 deputies and the head of the Environmental Council at the White House were tasked with developing the American agenda for that Kyoto Climate Conference. Our work at the Department of Interior dealt with the land. And we believed at that time that climate change would do 2 things. One, it would move everything northward, which it is, and everything upward into the higher elevations, which it is. And the question is, can the flora survive? Can it move up as the temperatures go higher and higher? And the answer, at least for this Joshua tree situation, is possibly. Otherwise, it's going to be another eradication of a very unique plant here in the United States. Same thing around the world. Very, very serious problem with climate change. Water is absolutely the central piece of it. Without water, it's over.
Now, while President Biden has made environmental issues, scaling up renewable energy and green growth, priority of his administration. A new report recently found that the US accounts for more than a third of the expansion in global oil and gas production planned by the mid-century. Then you have lower income countries, many of which incorporate our audience, they're being asked to cut their fossil fuel use in the name of climate mitigation, even though clean energy isn't enough for now to power their economic growth and lead them out of poverty. This has led to obvious resentment toward wealthier nations like the US. What would you say to developing countries that are the ones least responsible to climate change, but disproportionately bearing a brunt of it, that accuse the West of being hypocritical when it comes to fossil fuel use?
Well, certainly the United States is one of the major producers of fossil fuels. There are two specific types of fossil fuel. One is the petroleum, the oil, crude oil and the like. The other is natural gas. What we need to do around the developing world is to move away from coal and oil, using natural gas as a transition, and that is in fact happening in much of the electrical energy production in the United States. So phase out coal first, and then phase out your petroleum, oil, gasoline, diesel, and move in that transition period with your natural gas, far less carbon emissions from that. And that is in fact part of the strategy. Get to the electrical systems, renewable electrical systems immediately. And that's the Biden administration. What we call the Inflation Reduction Act is specifically to take that path and get immediately, or as quickly as we possibly can in the United States, to the renewable energy systems, all of them, solar, wind, even hydrogen, which can be produced in a very, very simple process called electrolysis. You take electricity, you run that through water, and you break the water into its two elements, oxygen and hydrogen. Capture the hydrogen, use that as a source. So there are different ways we can do this. With regard to the developing world, we do owe them. They are suffering, as I mentioned, the Sahel of Africa, major problem. Migration, climate migration is a major challenge to Europe and to the United States. A good many of the immigrants that are trying to seek asylum in the United States are facing climate crisis in their home countries. Certainly this is an issue in the Central America area, and obviously in Africa and beyond. So we have to address that in multiple ways. One is economic support and different and the use of modern techniques of agriculture, and in some cases there are projects in the Sahel, the southern Sahel of Africa, to try to stabilize not the climate, but try to stabilize the agriculture in that area. Various projects are underway, funded by the United States and by Europe, to attempt to do that so that people can continue to survive and thrive in those regions. Whether we can do it or not remains to be seen. Some of it will be straight out economic assistance. But what we are finding in the Africa region is that the climate crisis creates political instability. And violent extreme organizations grow in that environment and create very serious conflicts. Now, how to deal with that? Yes, we do deal. The Europeans, well, even Russia in a bad way, but nonetheless, the United States and others, with military. That's a short-term solution. It may be necessary for various reasons. Niger is a number one example at the moment of an attempt to use military, French and the United States, to create stability. Not with great success. In fact, we now have a very unstable political situation there with the recent coup. And where does it go from here? The underlying factor is climate change and the instability in the economy, in the villages, in the communities, in the agricultural sectors, and the lack of water. So what to do? Well, bring the resources, try to stabilize the economy, try to stabilize the agriculture as best as possible. The military options are short-term and ultimately will not be successful unless you deal with the underlying economic, cultural, and environmental issues.
So on that note, what are your hopes heading as we head into the UN Climate Change Summit in Dubai in November, including when it comes to greater climate financing for developing countries?
Well, two pieces to this. First of all, the developed countries, the G20, whatever you want to call, whatever number you may want to put to it, we must transition rapidly, immediately and rapidly, to renewable energy sources and move away from the intense carbon energy sources. All of us, the United States should be a leader, and we can be. We have the resources, we certainly have the money, we have the law in place now that would provide the structure for us to accomplish that. China can talk a good story, and they certainly do a lot of solar and wind, but they're doing more and more coal. So are other countries. For example, coming out of that conference, we should, the United States and other advanced economies, should focus on those countries that are using coal as their energy source today and target the most egregious, least effective, efficient coal plants and remove those and substitute advanced low carbon energy systems for that. It's been said that in the Philippines, if you take out a half a dozen of the worst, oldest, least efficient coal plants, you could have a very, very significant reduction of the carbon emissions of that country. The same can be said for other countries that are using antiquated, inefficient, very disruptive coal-fired power plants. So you focus on the worst of the bunch. Some of those are still in the United States, and we ought to immediately transition those to natural gas as a transition while we build out the renewable energy systems here. Similarly, for other countries around the world.
So let's switch gears a bit now to Ukraine. You spent over a dozen years on the House Armed Services Committee, which has given you an up-close view of U.S. efforts to help Ukraine against Russia's invasion. So far, that help has been readily forthcoming, but Republicans have signaled they won't sign a quote-unquote blank check. Congress has already approved well over $100 billion in military, economic, humanitarian, and other forms of assistance for Ukraine. Public opinion is also increasingly divided on the issue. So where do you see Ukraine funding going in the months ahead, including the current $24 billion package that the Biden administration is seeking?
First, if I might just put a little fact on the table. The U.S. participation across all of those sectors that you just mentioned, humanitarian, as well as the military, is less than the European Union. So taken in total, the European Union is providing more support. And that comes in multiple ways, as is ours, humanitarian, refugee, and the like, as well as military. Many of those countries are providing far more percentage of their GDP than the United States. Our support in terms of percentage of GDP is very, very small. And compared to other countries, even woefully small. Now, this is really for democracy and in my view, for a stable world in a fight that we must be in. And it is a fight that Ukraine cannot lose. Russia is an aggressor, not a new aggressor. Russian aggression under Putin, reestablishing what he sees as the rightful place of Russia as the dominant country in that part of Europe and Asia, began in Georgia more than a decade, 12 years ago, actually, when Russia invaded and took over 2 provinces in Georgia. That was followed by Crimea and then the eastern Ukraine. Russia under Putin is an expansionary dictatorship. And Putin has been very, very clear about how he intends to rebuild the Russian Empire. And that means to subjugate Ukraine, literally to fold Ukraine into Russia. He's been very clear about it. And similarly, he wants to reestablish the Russian influence over Eastern Europe, as existed during the Cold War with what was known as the Warsaw Pact. So beware, be aware as well as beware of what is underway here. If we pull back out of Ukraine, even if this rhetoric about pulling back takes hold, the ability of Russia to eventually subjugate Ukraine will happen. It'll certainly happen fast if we pull out our military. And the unfolding events will be devastating to Europe and to the United States and to the world order. Because what is at play here is not just Europe. Guaranteed. No doubt about it. China is looking at this and going, is the United States willing to stay the course in Ukraine? If not, will the United States stay the course in the Western Pacific? Not just Taiwan, but the Western Pacific. And I've had meetings recently with our allies, the major countries in the Western Pacific. And they're looking at the United States staying the course in Ukraine, seeing it through, as difficult as it may be, as expensive as it is and will be, or can the United States be counted as a stable, all-in ally in the Western Pacific? If not, watch out. Watch out. China will do exactly what Russia is doing, and that is attempt to dominate. That's going to set off a whole series of problems in the Western Pacific that'll be extraordinarily dangerous to a peaceful world.
Now, since Putin's invasion, U.S. aid has provided more than $23 billion in assistance to Ukraine, which is in development circles a pretty stunning figure. And an issue that's come up with us very often that we've written about is that this is such a big figure compared to other underfunded humanitarian crises around the world. What would you say to those who worry that Ukraine is siphoning attention and resources away from what are equally deserving humanitarian conflicts, which may not have the same geopolitical underpinnings that supporting Ukraine against Russia does?
Well, this issue of continued assistance in the developing world is not new. This goes back to, well, Patty and my days in the Peace Corps. This was being debated, this was being discussed there, too much, too little, not enough, not in the right places, and so on. So it's not a new debate. It is, however, an extremely important debate and discussion. I just made an argument, which I hope was cogent and correct, about the importance of Ukraine. Yes, there is a lot of money. Nevertheless, the Biden administration, with the support last session of Congress, supported increasing development aid around the world. That was after 4 years of the Trump administration, in which Trump stated very clearly his view of Africa. Those whole countries. And US aid followed in a very significant decline. The Trump administration had no use for international assistance and he stated in the worst of terms his view of at least those developing countries in Africa. The Biden administration has been assiduously working to restore America's position in economic development assistance throughout the world, trying to restore America's position. His first 2 years, he was successful in increasing American foreign aid assistance in multiple ways. And there are many, many different ways in which that is accomplished. We now have a Congress that is dominated by the Republican Party, but not by the traditional Republican Party. The House of Representatives is controlled by what I call the crazies. There are about maybe 20 maximum, of which there are 10 that are just out. They're coming from a different universe. And we can say what you like to say about them. And what I'd like to say about them is, what world do they live in? It's not the world that the rest of the population of this universe, of this planet, see. Total denial of climate change, total denial of anything to do with dealing with the existential crisis that this planet faces. With regard to food around the world, no, there's no problem. We need that at home. On and on and on. Foreign aid, it's a waste of money. So it's going to be difficult. It is. We're going to see this in this year's appropriations. Major cuts in food assistance, major cuts in foreign aid. So what do? Well, we fight it out. But right now, the Biden administration has been very clear in its first 2 years, and as it deals with a very difficult political situation now in the Congress, to restore America's position as an essential partner in the social and economic development of the entire world.
Now, beyond the so-called crazies that you mentioned, I mean, foreign aid is often a political punching bag, as you well know. Even though it's like Ukraine, it accounts for a very small percentage of overall federal spending, and there's a lot of misconceptions around it. But in the end, there has been some bipartisanship on it, especially in the Senate. You've got Senator Lindsey Graham, for instance, has in the past supported, has gone against deep foreign aid cuts. Are you at least optimistic, despite the dynamics, especially in the House, that ultimately some foreign aid can emerge unscathed?
Well, you noticed I very carefully did not mention the Senate when I was talking about the crazies. The Senate is the hope at the moment. They are moving the appropriation bills. They're moving key legislation. It's going to put, hopefully, a lot of pressure on the House of Representatives to stop the foolishness that's dominating the Republican Party. We'll see. And yes, the Senate is on top of this. Better this year than last year. There were a couple of senators in the previous Congress that were difficult. They seem to be quieter this year than the previous Congress. That's good news. So we're hopeful. I was talking to some of my colleagues. We were trying to get a grip on all of this yesterday, and I said, we need to support the Senate. We're not going to get much in the House. The House is at best in chaos. There are other ways of describing the current situation. We're headed for a government shutdown unless there's a change in the Republican Congress and the rational Republicans, of which is the great majority of them, gain the control. Right now, they don't have it. So I'm hopeful, and we'll see how this turns out. The ultimate compromise will not be a robust foreign assistance program. I don't see how that could happen, given where the Republicans are in the House of Representatives. If they can get past the chaos of their own caucus, it's still not going to be a robust foreign assistance program. I will tell you also that there's a great deal of hunger around the world, and in the United States. One of the most important pieces of legislation on this matter, not just in the United States, but beyond, will be the Farm Bill, which will be written this fall and perhaps passed before the first of the year. But it's going to be critically important. That's the food aid within the United States, the SNAP program, food stamps, and also it will set the pace for food assistance around the world. And so we need to watch that very, very carefully. That is not development money, but that is survival. And that's an ongoing challenge around the world. Patty and I spent many, many years of our life dealing with the issue of famine and starvation around the world. Most recently, we were in the refugee camps in northern Kenya just less than a month ago. And once again, while there is food aid being delivered there were families that had arrived, and you see all the signs of starvation in the young kids. And there is a 24% reduction in American food assistance to those camps in northern Kenya, where there are almost 250,000 people. So there's 25% less food every day for the people that are in those camps. And those are refugees from Sudan, Somalia, Uganda, and other countries in that region. I would like to take some of those Republicans and say, let's go see the world. Let's go see what the world is dealing with, what people are dealing with in other parts of this planet, and then come back and tell me that it's not worth a few tens of millions of dollars of the money of the wealthiest country in the world.
Now, I want to make sure we have enough time to get to audience questions, and I see them filtering in. We also have a few that were submitted in advance, and this particular question follows up on what you just discussed, so I want to go ahead and read it. Well, thank you, Representative Garamendi, for your time this morning and attention to global food insecurity, and including the Farm Bill. CARE, with over 20 implementing organizations, are extremely concerned that the American Farmers Feed the World Act, which you co-sponsored, will have devastating impacts to international food assistance programs within the Farm Bill. The loss of Food for Peace resilience building programs alone would result in 3 million people without assistance. So how can we ensure communities like those in Ethiopia have the tools they need to feed themselves when aid organizations are forced to make programming choices based on legislative constraints designed by those with commercial interests? So a long question, but certainly relevant to what you just discussed.
Not a new debate.
Mm-hmm.
The reality here is that the organizations that do provide humanitarian assistance, CARE, and other organizations are an essential part of any effort to deal with hunger and economic development, social development around the world. They're key players in it, but they're not the only player. And so the American Farmers Feed the World is the other part of a strategy to deal with hunger, wherever it may be. the social economic development as well as the distribution of food is critically important. And these organizations, CARE and others, do that. They don't do it alone. There are other programs, World Food Program that does direct assistance as well as support organizations like CARE that do work on the ground. In part, it's a scramble for money. It's a scramble for money. These organizations depend upon cash from governments around the world to support their operations, understandably so, and correctly. There's nothing wrong with that. However, where will the food come from that they then distribute? Will they buy it on the market? Ukraine used to be a major supplier of that food. And in fact, when we were at the refugee camps just less than a month ago in Kakuma, northern Kenya, in one of the warehouses, there were perhaps several hundred sacks of grain. One entire row had an American flag on it. Another row had Ukraine on those sacks of grain. Undoubtedly, the World Food Program at that point had purchased Ukrainian grain and bringing it to the camp. Good source, good use of money. And it may very well have been American cash that was used to accomplish that. And support of the humanitarian organization that was then responsible for the distribution of that food. The other several hundred sacks were donated American grain. So there's a combination here of cash and, in this case, grain. There's a political element here. And for our friends in CARE and other organizations, please pay attention to the political element. Take a look at the US Congress today. Take a look at what it takes to pass a food program within the United States. It is a political, it's a joining of two very powerful political sectors. Americans that are concerned about food and hunger. This is domestic. Same thing applies internationally. And American farmers that want to produce the food to satiate that hunger. That's the political dynamic. And if you cash out, which some of these organizations want, and CARE was one of them, I'm not sure they're there today, but a decade ago, they wanted to cash everything out and simply buy food wherever it might be available in the world market, claiming that that was more efficient. And in some ways it was, and could be today, unless you're going to buy Ukrainian grain. But the political dynamic would be devastating. To think for a moment that you're going to get cash and not at the simultaneously support American agriculture in the Farm Bill, not going to happen. So keep in mind the political dynamics. Yes, there should be cash available to these organizations so that they can use it for their organization, for the distribution of food, for other things that they need to do to get the food to where it is needed. And they're not the only organizations that do that. Simultaneously, there will be no money if there is no support from American agriculture.
Gotcha. Now, we received also several questions relating back to Ukraine, and this was one of the questions that I was going to ask, which deals with the issue of corruption. The question is, what strategies are in place to promote good governance, transparency, and accountability in the use of resources allocated for resilience building in Ukraine? Certainly that includes humanitarian assistance, but also so much of the military assistance and weapons that have gone to Ukraine.
The US government and the European governments that support Ukraine are at this moment, as you and I are talking, diligently auditing the flow of military assistance into Ukraine, as well as the auditing of humanitarian aid. So outside organizations, outside of the Ukrainian government, are doing that. In the early days of this war, that was an issue. Kyiv and other communities were not safe, and for the most part, almost totally American on the ground who shut down our embassy. And so we did not have people on the ground to do the auditing and to follow. That is not the case any longer, nor has that been the case for about the last almost 12 months now. Similarly, the European are doing it. And anyone that's been following the news knows that the Zelensky government is constantly addressing corruption issues. People are being fired from time to time, often. People are being moved when corruption is found, and that's necessary. But I would suggest that overall, Ukraine corruption, while it still exists, is not the major problem in that country. It continues to deserve our attention, and we must. And where it does exist, there's clear evidence that the Zelensky government is willing to take on the highest echelons of their government and replace them. For example, within the last 7 days, the Minister of Defense, who by all accounts was not corrupt, was very, very effective, was replaced because there was some corruption within the military. And so he paid the price and has been replaced. And similarly, now, we need to be aware that within the United States, corruption does exist. And people are brought to justice as a result of that. Similarly, around the world, in every country, this is an ongoing issue for every country, the most developed to the least developed. Now, if you want the greatest example of corruption, you might want to take on a view of Russia and what has transpired in Russia over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is corruption in that country that continues to empower Putin. The Putin government has used corruption, that is the diversion of the assets and the resources of the Russian people, to his oligarch friends, who then support him, almost entirely with one very, very notable exception, who somehow died in an unexplained airplane crash, Bogosian. So yes, corruption is something we always must watch. It's very, very much on the minds of the American government, and the American government, together with European governments, work daily with the Zelensky government to deal with the auditing. And when corruption is found, Zelensky's been very, very clear. He'll take on the upper echelons of his administration to deal with it.
Now, I know we're running on time here, running up on time. So I wanted to wrap up with one final question that circles back to the Peace Corps, which I know you touched on before, but I think it's worth reiterating. So the question is, how can the U.S. Congress help the Peace Corps meet its goals in a more and more challenging world?
Well, first of all, the U.S. Congress needs to understand what the Peace Corps can do. It is the best manifestation of the humanity of America. You've already said that for the last 13 years, I've been on the Armed Services Committee, the last place I'd ever thought I'd work in Congress. But I find it to be an extraordinary important place for me to work and to bring the values of the Peace Corps to that very critical part of the American government. In a conversation within the last 7 months with the commander of the Indo-PACOM Command. This is the admiral that's responsible for all of the American military from Hawaii all the way to the Indian Ocean, all of those countries. He said, John, I know you were Peace Corps volunteers. Yes. He said, please bring the Peace Corps back to the South Asian countries. Bring them back immediately. They can do what I cannot do with all of my military power. They cannot represent the best of America. We come in with guns and they know we have power. You bring the Peace Corps and they know that we have humanity in mind. And at this moment, the Peace Corps is returning to some of the countries in the Southern Pacific, Southeastern Pacific, all to the good. Similarly, around the world, as I said before, countries are clamoring for the return of the Peace Corps. And I can cite dozens of examples of where world leaders today were taught by Peace Corps volunteers in their high schools or in their villages. And those people have gone on to lead their countries. And that gives them an insight into the United States that cannot be replicated in any other way. And if we had an hour, I will share with you story after story after story of where it's those volunteers 20, 30 years ago and 20, 30 years from today into the future, those interactions that those volunteers have with their host country nationals will inure to the benefit of world peace and certainly to the benefit of relationships with the United States, as well as to the citizens of those countries. So we're going to get the Peace Corps reauthorization done. We will fight for the funding going forward. And the result of it will be that the Peace Corps will, in the next year to 18 months, reestablish some 8,000, maybe more volunteers around the world. And so that's our goal, and we intend to meet it.
Well, we wish you the best with your goal. I know our readers find it very important as well. And I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Congressman Garamendi, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone else who joined this conversation. We have other newsmakers in our Global Leadership Series, including Congressman Joaquin Castro coming up. So please be sure to go to devex.com, sign up for our daily newswire for all of the latest updates. And in the meantime, Congressman and everyone, wishing everyone a safe and happy weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.